Okay, hello and welcome everybody to our third installment in the series, exploring the different mitzvahs which connect to the protection of the land of Israel. So the truth is that tonight actually is not so much connected to Israel the way maybe the last 2 weeks were. So last week we discussed Tefillin, we discussed Mezuzah, and the previous week we discussed Tzedakah. So those were more directly connected to the protection of the land of Israel. Tonight we are talking about things which are more general, but they are part of the 10 Mitzvot, the 10 mitzvah campaigns that the Rebbe made, which of course are special mitzvahs which protect the Jewish people, generally speaking. So important to discuss as well. So we're talking about the mitzvah of kosher. This is mitzvah kashrus. So I believe this began, the Rebbe instituted this in the year 1975. 1975, the Rebbe came out with this talk about the idea of mitzvah kashrus. And I think we know this saying which goes that you are what you eat. You know that saying? You are what you eat. You ever heard of that? So there's a saying that goes, you are what you eat. So literally it means that basically, I guess you got to eat healthy. Maybe that's what it's trying to bring out. But the point basically is that in Yiddishkeit, that's definitely true, that we look at what vitalizes a person as very connected to a person's neshama, and what a person injects into himself, ingests, meaning the foods that a person eats are very much, play a big role in the person's spiritual life. And if a person eats kosher, then you're taking in things which are in line with your soul. And if you're taking in things which are not kosher, then these are things which are not in line with your soul. And therefore it's damaging to a person's neshama. And therefore kosher is such an important thing. And the way that the Rebbe approached this mitzvah of kashrus, why the Rebbe instituted it, was the Rebbe said that we see clearly that there's a decline in the spiritual sensitivity of people these days, right? So maybe you could say that in previous generations, they had less access to Torah. Maybe people were much more simple. These days, people are more learned. Possible to say that. But at the same time, used to be that there was a certain spiritual sensitivity which exists less today. And the Rebbe said that in order to increase and to add in the spiritual sensitivity, we have to add in keeping kosher and encouraging people to keep kosher. And therefore, the Rebbe put in place people who were in charge of this mitzvah of mitzvah kashrus. And so there were tons of different things that they did to encourage people to keep kosher. So one of the things was, have you ever seen the cookbook, like a purple cookbook? It's called The Spice and the Spirit. You ever seen that? There's a cookbook. It's called The Spice and the Spirit. So it's a regular size cookbook. But how did it come out? It came out because the Rebbe was talking about this mitzvah of kashrus, and they realized that people need to have what to cook. If you're encouraging people to keep kosher, they need to have options of what to make kosher. So they put together a cookbook, and it was so popular, it sold almost 100,000 copies in a couple of years, that they came out with a new edition, added more recipes, made it more professional, and it still comes out today. It's this purple cookbook called The Spice and the Spirit. And that was part of the mitzvah of kashrus. Now, not only was the mitzvah to encourage people to eat kosher, it was also to kosher their homes. So to take their pots and pans and kitchens and stuff to kosher. And people went out to people's homes and they would do it for free. They would come to blowtorch and they would blowtorch all their stuff and kosher everything, and that would make their home kosher. So the mitzvah of kashrus had many different things, encouraging people to eat kosher and then also to kosher their home at the same time. And of course, it's a very special mitzvah to focus on keeping kosher. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to focus on certain halachic things related to kosher, things which maybe you may not have heard of, things which maybe don't cross your mind right away. You don't necessarily realize that these are even issues. But of course, the more time you study the subject, the more you realize that a lot of different things come up and which you may not be aware of. So let's jump right in. A vegan restaurant. Vegan restaurant means there's no dairy, there's no meat, there's no fish even. I don't think there's even fish in a vegan restaurant. So you would think, based on just a simple understanding of kosher, what could be wrong, right? Kosher vegetables are kosher; they grow from the ground. So what do we know that things which are not kosher? We know the animals that are not kosher, right? So certain animals you're allowed to eat, certain animals you can't eat. Certain fish you're allowed to eat, certain fish you can't eat. Certain birds you can eat, certain birds you can't. Right? No lobster and no the other stuff. But we know pretty much what's kosher and what's not kosher. Hey, all right. So a person, coming to a vegan restaurant could ask himself, what could possibly be the issue with a vegan restaurant? You're coming, you're having salads, what would be the problem? And actually, it's a mistake. It's a problem because people tend to think that way, and therefore tend to go to these type of restaurants, vegan restaurants, and think there's nothing wrong because, after all, the ingredients which in their mind are kosher or not kosher are not there. There's no meat, there's no fish, there's no dairy. So what could be the problem? So what we're going to do is to kind of explore the mitzvah of kashrus and to look at different areas of kosher life and to understand some of the details. We'll look at it through this prism of a vegan restaurant. Let's see what different issues would come up in a vegan restaurant that you wouldn't think of. So just off the bat, what's an issue with a vegan restaurant that you can think of?
It's made of dairy utensils.
Okay, but let's say it's a vegan restaurant, so they don't use dairy. There's no dairy.
But they could have utensils that were used for dairy.
No, so if it's a place which doesn't use dairy, they probably wouldn't be using dairy.
They don't eat.
They don't check bugs.
Ah, very good. So bugs, which in Hebrew is called telayim. Telayim means bugs. So in the Torah, actually, there is certain bugs which, if a person eats them, you could be transgressing 6 prohibitions just eating one bug. In yeshiva in Melbourne, we had a Rosh Yeshiva. His name was Rabbi Cohen. He was a very straight shooter guy. This guy was like no nonsense. So he like always looked the same, dressed the same, everything like a real yekka, And the joke was that in Australia there's a lot of flies. I don't know if it's like Australia there's a lot of flies. So in the summer we would go to camp, and the yeshiva would go to the camp also, and they would have seder. So the camp would be going on, and the bachrim would partly do camp, partly learn. It was a nice thing. Anyways, he was giving a shiur outside, and he's busy, talking, and a fly comes straight into his mouth, and it obviously didn't come out. So, so I don't know if the story ever happened or not, but the joke was that Rabbi Cohen, this rabbi, stops and he says, I would just over 6 lavin. I just transgressed 6 prohibitions. He had it all worked out. Exactly. So the fact is that eating bugs can be a transgression of 6 lavin, 6 prohibitions. It's a pretty serious thing to think about.
Yeah.
And the reality is, and it's quite interesting, like as I was doing kind of research into this shiur, it turned out that it used to be bugs were less of an issue because of the way that things were grown. Let's say pesticides were used much more, on a much bigger basis because they weren't aware of the type of other issues that can come from pesticides, right? So they were using a lot of pesticides, and then they realized the pesticides can cause, cancer and this and that. So they kind of the FDA, you know about this?
Yeah.
Yeah. They said that certain pesticides can't be used. So these days, there's much less pesticides in the foods, which automatically means there's more bugs.
Yeah.
And I actually read a story which is in the OK magazine. OK Kosher puts out a magazine every couple times a year, and they wrote that there was a story that a Swiss company, they make cereal bars, so they wanted to include in their cereal bars raspberry pieces. Now, if you know raspberries have been they're infested.
Yeah.
And so they said, like, can you find out if these are good? So the OK went to the company that they wanted to source the raspberries from and said, give us some samples and we'll check them out. and they took the samples, and they were completely like infested, and they were worried. Maybe the Swiss company is going to want to pull their hashgacha, and they actually were very thankful. Like they were like, "Wow, thank you. We weren't aware of how bad the infestation is. We're okay with it. It's fine." But basically, the point is that it's certain fruits. It's actually very, very hard. It's very probable that you have an infestation. These like tiny little bugs, but it's a real problem. And so the way that halacha kind of uses things is that, do you have to check every bug? Do you have to check your apple for bugs before you eat the apple?
You wash it off.
You wash it off, but maybe there's a bug inside. How do you know? So the way it works is like this: that halacha looks at it as there are three categories. One is roiv. So if roiv means majority of these types of fruits have bugs, then we say you have to check it, because a person has to assume that there's a bug. If only 10% of them have bugs, then you should check them. But it's not like we assume that there is one. You have to check it. If you didn't, or whatever, then it's going to be less of a problem. And then there are things which don't really have an infestation. And so unless you see one, you don't have to worry about it. So that explains certain parts of what you can and can't buy from let's say, a vegan place. If they're serving sliced apple, very likely that's okay, because apple has no infestation. It's fine. But let's say they're making a smoothie with kale, and kale is infested. So that might be an issue, because what you're doing is you're really taking something which is the right of them do have, and you're basically pureeing it, which technically the halachas of these things is that it would be batal, right? It would be nullified in a greater mixture, right? So one of the things that halacha talks about is that there's this idea called bittul, nullification, right? So if it's in a bigger mixture, it's going to be batal in there. So technically you would say it should be batal in the big mixture. But we know there's a rule which said you're not allowed to lechatchila, you're not allowed to go ahead and be mevatel, nullify an isser, right? So if you know there's a prohibited item here, you can't go and intentionally nullify it. If it happens anyway, after the fact. So if it's a type of fruit which you absolutely know it's infested, most of them are infested. So let's say you go and buy frozen raspberries, you want to go throw that into a smoothie, that would probably be a problem. Because the chances are those frozen raspberries have bugs there. And by you putting them into the blender and turning it into a smoothie, you are being mevatel. Because
die if they...
So, but even dead bugs are a problem.
Yeah, but you wash it off, it comes off.
You're saying you mix it all up. You put it in a thing, you blend it all up. Bugs and everything all get blended up.
Yeah, but you wash it first.
No, but not even. Yeah, you can't even get them out.
Can't bug. If you look at a blackberry, it's full of bugs.
Yeah.
Same thing as raspberry, full of bugs.
Yeah. So that's so that would be a raspberry or something which is roiv. Most of them have bugs. To go and make a smoothie out of that would be a problem, because you're intentionally going and being mevatel. Now, what about a fruit which something like I think a strawberry is like this? Strawberries are not roiv, but very often they are. So making a smoothie out of a strawberry would probably be fine, because you are not you're not intentionally being mevatel the thing. You don't even know if it's there, right? Meaning the problem is if I know that it's there and I go and put it in a smoothie, I'm intentionally being mevatel. But if I don't know it's there, it just might be there. Well, then it's not like I'm intentionally going and being mevatel. I'm making a smoothie. Happens to be there's a bug in the thing, it's going to get smoothied up also. But it's not like I'm intentionally going and being mevatel this. I don't even know if it's there.
Yeah.
Whereas a raspberry, it's there. And therefore, or basically the way halacha looks at it is that since roiv most of the time it's there, we assume it's there. So that's problem number one when it comes to an issue of a vegan restaurant. Okay, let's move on to number two of a vegan restaurant. What's problem number two in a vegan restaurant?
Could it be good?
Pas Yisrael. Okay, let's explain what Pas Yisrael is. Pas Yisrael literally means bread baked by a Jew. That halacha says that a person who follows the proper kosher guidelines is only allowed to eat bread that is baked by a Jew. Why? if all the ingredients are kosher, why do you need a Jew to be involved? So this stems from the fact that as long as we are sitting, eating with, fraternizing with anybody, which happens over food, the fact is we hang out with people over food. So if we're doing that, it's going to lead to us mingling with our non-Jewish neighbors much more, which can lead to, I have a son, you have a daughter, let's get married. So to avoid close, intimate relationships with non-Jews, the Chachamim, the sages, set up certain boundaries and said, don't cross this line. Don't eat bread that's baked by a non-Jew, which will probably mean you won't eat in his house. You don't eat in his house, you won't come to have these close relationships where you're going to come to intermarriage. Right. Now, they set certain guidelines of what's considered pas Yisrael. So what's considered bread baked by a Jew? What's the definition of that? Does a Jew have to own the bakery? Does he have to own the bread? So basically the way it works is that a Jew has to turn on the fire. Turn on the fire. Yeah. So it could be that he turns on the fire in the morning and you bake 100,000 loaves. Doesn't matter. As long as the fire was turned on by a Jew, it's kosher. Not only that, these days they have these tunnel ovens, which it's turned on and it goes for weeks. They do a run, and that's fine. The Jew turns it on once, the fire keeps going, it's fine. And that's what's something called pas Yisrael. Now, you might be wondering, why is it that many good Jews out there who go to the store and buy bread off of the shelf, even though it's not pas Yisrael, right? So your average loaf that you're going to find in the bakery is not pas Yisrael. The average loaf of bread you're going to find might be kosher, might have an OU, but it's not pas Yisrael. So the question is, I understand, if this is a necessary part of kosher, how does it have an OU and it's not pas Yisrael, right? Yeah. How do these things go together? So here comes an interesting kind of thing with the way halacha works. And that is that halacha says that if a certain decree or a certain thing was put in place by the sages, but it wasn't accepted by the Jewish people because it was too difficult for them to take on, their decree actually becomes invalid. It actually falls away. Very interesting kind of thing to think about. Mm-hmm. And that is actually what happened with this called decree enactment of pas Yisrael. So the sages said, we want that Jews should be involved in the baking of the bread. They should light the fires. And Jews started keeping it, but it didn't become widespread. It became too hard for them to do. And you can imagine, because these are Jewish communities spread all over the place. Who said there's a kosher bakery? And so where are they buying the bread from? From Goyim. Who said the Goyim are interested in having a Jew come and turn on the ovens? It's not like these days where turning on the oven means you turn a thing. Then it's like, it's a whole taradam to start a fire and to come. So for them, it was just too difficult to follow this. They said if all the ingredients are kosher bread. And therefore the whole thing didn't really get accepted in all communities around the world.
Can I just push the dough and can it become?
No, it's not about the dough. It's about the way that it's baked. It's like the way that the fire is started. That's the way that the Chacham set up. This is how.
How about you set up the oven?
Set up the oven in what way?
I could just build it.
Well, that's only once. I mean, what happens?
Yeah, and then they could make.
No, so it's each time that the fire is turned on. Yeah. So that's why today there's a leniency which says that in a bakery, which is not even local, like a loaf of bread that you're buying from the store is being made who knows where. You're never going to meet the owner anyway. You're never going to be hanging out with the non-Jewish owner anyway, because you don't even know who he is. He doesn't know who you are. He maybe lives in a different state. Combine that with the fact that it was never really taken on and accepted by the Jewish communities. So therefore, that the idea of pas Yisrael has kind of fallen away in certain communities, in many communities. Normative halacha says you don't have to keep pas Yisrael.
What if the owner is Jewish? Do they still have to turn on the fire? The owner is Jewish. Yeah. They still have to turn on the fire?
Yeah. Why? Because that's just the way the Chum said. The way that kosher bread is one which a Jew is involved in the baking. That's just how it is. So
I thought it was about the owner.
No.
No.
Making the fire.
Turning on the
That's
fire.
what the Chacham said for Bichas.
Yeah.
You have to have a Jewish person put on the fire.
So that's why you're going to see that people going into the bakery and just buying bread. Now, the fact though is that many people do still keep Pas Yisrael. Why is that? So the fact is that this was something which was instituted. So even though technically normative halacha says you don't have to keep it anymore because it wasn't accepted, but this was something they instituted, and therefore there's something to this. But also there is a certain element of a deeper, the Hasidic way of looking at the mitzvahs, which is that mitzvahs are not just about do's and don'ts. Mitzvahs are to really create a stronger connection to Hashem, and those mitzvahs are already just channels through which one connects to Hashem. And so too with something like Pas Yisrael. Pas Yisrael, which was instituted by the sages, but the sages in their wisdom, which were given to them by God. So their mitzvahs are also channels with which to live a more godly life. And the Hasidic approach to this whole thing is that why are we being so lenient about Pas Yisrael? Because it was a staple. And back in the day, since it was a staple, they couldn't afford to have a Jew be involved in the process because it would just make it too difficult. So we have to go and do what we need to do. But for that same reason is also a reason to be more strict. Why? Because something which is a staple means it's very important. It's a major part of your life. Right. It's a major part of your diet. And something which is such a major part of your diet perhaps needs the greatest scrutiny to make sure that it's completely connected and involved with a holy setting in a holy place. And therefore, specifically, the staple of your diet should be one which is baked by a Jew in the way that the sages wanted it to be done, because you want your diet to be in line with a godly way, which involves a Jew being involved in it throughout. So it's kind of a twist, which takes the same reason to be lenient to go the other way and say, be extra careful with it. So again, going back to a vegan restaurant, this would depend on your custom. Many Hasidim are strict about Pas Yisrael. So definitely, my family, we keep Pas Yisrael. We don't have donuts, and we don't have, actually donuts is a different separate issue, but we don't have bread, we don't have bagels, we don't have anything that's not Pas Yisrael, which makes it difficult, right? And so going to a vegan restaurant where they're going to be serving, some whole grain bread, that would be a problem of Pas Yisrael for those who hold a Pas Yisrael. For those who are more lenient with Pas Yisrael, maybe that would be less of an issue. As we'll see, might be other issues involved, but that particular issue might not be an issue to think about. Okay, so far we discussed two issues in a vegan restaurant. We discussed the terlaim, the bugs, and we've discussed the Pas Yisrael, the bread, which maybe they're going to serve, which again, according to, the best option is to have a Jew be involved in the baking process and that might be involved an issue when a person goes to a vegan restaurant. Okay, number 3. This is a famous one. Wine.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I have one question. Can a camera be considered a mashgiach?
Great question. So it really depends for which part of which things it's watching for. Something yes and something not. So like Chalav Yisrael wouldn't work for, but other things are good.
Like you could watch it. You guys could sit somewhere else and be just like watching a bunch of screen and be like, hey.
Or even press a button. So let's say I'm sitting in America and I press a button which makes the oven in Thailand turn on. So that could work.
It does work?
I believe so.
So you just press one button and all the ovens in the world turn on.
Again, many kashrus agencies will go the extra mile and like not, suffice with it. They'll say we're going to send somebody, but yeah, there's definitely room for it.
Well, why can't you do with color? So another thing.
So that's something else, and maybe we'll get into it soon. Okay, wine. So we know that wine is a very complicated issue in kosher stuff. The reason why wine first became a problem is that wine was used by pagans back in history for idol worship. And therefore, it was assumed that any wine that you buy from a non-Jew was made with the express purpose to use for idol worship.
So camera can be used for being scared with wine.
So let's not get into that so much now. So that's where the issue of wine first kind of became a problem. And really you see that throughout the Mishnah and the Gemara, discussions about wine and idol worship, that's the connection. Now, obviously today, that's not the concern, but the concern has evolved to be more one similar to the bread, which is that drinking wine is something which is you dine over, and it's part of the issue that drinking non-kosher wine and feasting in a non-Jewish setting could lead to intermarriage, assimilation, etc. And therefore, that's another boundary that the sages set, that wine needs to be watched and directed by a Jew. And it's very complicated. It's very detailed how much a Jew has to be involved in the process. It's really not easy to make kosher wine. And therefore, many kosher wines are actually made mezuzah. They're made in a way that you don't need a Jew to be involved in the whole process. You basically pasteurize the wine and you boil it up. And when you do that, the wine no longer becomes anytime the wine is boiled, it kind of loses the quality of the wine. Once you lose the quality, we're less concerned of it being, this very important drink that, you sit down and it's kind of like, it's a wine, nothing too special.
Does it taste different?
I don't actually know. I'm sure it does because they don't. I think it's treated as less of a low quality. Exactly.
What's the difference? You put it on the stove, put the fire on
It obviously does something to the wine.
Like barely 0.5.
Yeah. So that's the discussion of what we call yayin nesach. So basically, to have kosher wine today is important. It needs to be bought from a specific winery that does things in a kosher way. Chances are, if a person is going to a vegan restaurant, even if they're not serving him wine, many of the ingredients in salad dressings could have wine or grape juice or this, and that could be a real issue of a stam yenam, which we call wine without a kosher supervision. And so that's a whole separate issue, which if you're not going to a kosher vegan place, they're not going to be using kosher wines. So that would be something that a person would have to be careful of as well. Now, another issue, any other issues you can think of?
Vegan, everything is basically, there's no eggs, no eggs. Yeah.
Like maybe they could add
Fish,
some
no
milk.
fish.
Maybe they
Bishul,
could
but we already talked about, I guess.
No, so you're right. So bishul is the next one. So here comes another layer to this. So now you might be wondering, like, wow, these rabbis really made things complicated. And the answer is yes, they did. But
for good reason.
For good reason, exactly. And so we come to another kind of like boundary that the sages set up to create separation between Jews and non-Jews, again, not for the reasons of not, intermingling a lot. And besides for bread, that bread should be baked by a Jew, they said that cooked dishes, which are more,
fit for a king,
what we call fit for a king, but it's something which you'll sit down and have a meal with. It's not just a snack. It's not just a side dish. It's a real, important dish. Needs to be cooked by a Jew. What does it mean, cooked by a Jew? Again, light the fire. Light the fire, that's called being cooked by a Jew. That's enough of an involvement for a Jew to be involved to say that it's being cooked by a Jew. So things like, so many things. I mean, pasta would have to be cooked. The fire would have to be lit by a Jew. Anything. I mean, obviously outside of a vegan restaurant, but a steak would have to, a Jew would have to, a steak is a steak. Really any cooked dish that is a dish. It's like a real dish. Fish for sure. Yeah. Fish and meat and so many things. Like pasta, like we said, all these things would need to have what we call bishul yisrael, a Jew being involved in the cooking process. And that's something which is not debated. Unlike bread, which is, it wasn't really accepted, and therefore there's leniencies. Bishul Yisrael is across the board. There's no Orthodox community that doesn't hold a Bishul Yisrael.
What's interesting is like some fish you'll find an OU, but it's not necessarily Bishul Yisrael. I believe like tuna fish and some like sardines, things like this. So I was just wondering when you mentioned that, but it seems to be something different. The fact that there are fish products or certain things with that are OU parv, but not necessarily Bishul Yisrael.
Yeah. So I think the answer might be that it depends how the thing is cooked. Right, not every type of cooking is considered cooked. So, like, let's say,
or fit for a king, maybe a category, right?
Or that. So, let's say, for example, lox, smoked lox.
Mm-hmm.
Does that need Bishul Yisrael? The answer is not. We bought lox in Costco, and it's fine.
Right.
The answer is that the process of how they cook it makes a difference as well. Is it cooked or is it smoked? Smoked is not considered cooking, and therefore it's not a problem. Tuna, I think, like you're saying, the way that canned tuna is presented is not a important dish. It's just canned tuna, which you eat for lunch, as opposed to proper prepared fish.
Came up that I went to Boston for work, and I really don't eat sardines except when I travel on my own. I tried to find Saturdays, but I couldn't find that ones that were for sure Bishul. Israel.
It's complicated. So going to a vegan restaurant, that would be something to think about as well. That and by the way, in this regard, Sephardim are much more strict about Bishul Yisrael than Ashkenazim. So Ashkenazim say that all you need for Bishul Yisrael, for something to be cooked and be considered like it was cooked by a Jew, is for a Jew to turn on the fire. Sephardim are much more strict on that. They say that not only a Jew has to turn on the fire, a Jew has to actually place the item on the fire. Which is something interesting to think about, because let's say we have barbecues in our Chabad house, and we hire so we hired a non-Jewish guy to barbecue. So we give him the food, we turn on the fire, it's all good. Exactly. So you think about it, for a Sephardi, that would not work. That wouldn't be considered Bishul Yisrael.
Even though you're there.
We're there, and because according to the Sephardi poskim, Bishul Yisrael means putting it on the fire. So would be difficult to make that Bishul. So that's another issue in a vegan restaurant. Are the dishes which are being served being done Bishul Yisrael? And obviously the answer is no, because unless you have a Jew involved in turning on the fires, you're not going to have that. So that is another issue. So let's go through what we discussed so far. You walk into a vegan restaurant, everything looks great. All the ingredients are vegetables. What could be the problem? Answer is, number one, bugs. Number two, the bread they're going to serve you with a salad. So pas Yisrael, the idea that bread has to have a Jew involved in the cooking. Number three, wine. So any wine products need to be kosher wine, because wine is complicated. 4, Bishul Yisrael, that the cooked items, which are a major part of the meal, the fire needs to be turned on by a Jew for it to be kosher. So those are 4 major issues that come up with a vegan restaurant. So the answer is basically that a person's on the road, a person who wants to try to keep kosher, walking into a vegan restaurant is by no means a simple solution. It might just be better to go and go to a Target, buy a couple of vegetables yourself, and put together a salad, because you're most likely going to bump into issues along the way. And the same thing goes with buying smoothies, in a random, store, which is not kosher. That it could be done, but it gets complicated because you have to think about also if you're not in a kosher establishment, you're not in a vegan establishment, so the dishes are being washed together. So let's say your smoothie is being made in a utensil that was washed with other utensils, which those other utensils might have had non-kosher ingredients in them. And the taste transfers through the hot water that the dishes are being washed, and the taste transfers from one utensil to the other. And it makes the utensil that is making your smoothie not kosher, and that can impart flavor into your food as well. So the answer basically is that if you're on the road, there's ways that it could be done, but generally speaking, it's more complicated than not. Okay, that is the discussion of the vegan restaurant. Now, in our title for this year, we also discussed Belgian chocolate, and we discussed sherry casks.
Oh.
So let's talk about sherry casks for a second. The truth is that sherry casks is a very complicated halachic discussion. We're going to just give some of the major points to it, and we're not going to do a deep dive here. But here's the issue. Let's just take a step back, understand what goes into sherry cask whiskey. So it used to be sherry cask whiskey was what was always used. Sherry casks what was always used for whiskey, because what happened is that whiskey is made in Scotland. Barrels of Spanish wine would come from Spain, be shipped into the British area, and the barrels were used because to bottle them and then ship is a hassle. So instead of bottling them in Spain, sending over the bottles, they would send over barrels of wine and they would bottle it in England. So they had all these empty barrels, which they didn't want to go and schlep all the way back to Spain. So the people in Scotland said, hey, this is a great solution for us to bottle our scotch in. So they used the sherry casks to bottle their scotch. So in other words, scotch in sherry casks was actually how it was always done. Then what happened was that the Spanish winemakers started bottling their wine in Spain. So there were no sherry casks coming in the way it was. It wasn't a surplus of cheap barrels for the Scottish whiskey makers to buy. So where are they going to get the barrels from? They need to get it from somewhere. So they started getting it from the US, from bourbon makers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. The problem is that bourbon, the effect of bourbon on whiskey is less desirable than the effect of sherry on whiskey. Sherry tastes much better. So some companies said, whatever, we still can't afford to go and ship in sherry. Apparently sherry is much more expensive, the sherry casks. So we can't afford that, so we're still going to use the bourbon, but the more fancy whiskeys definitely use sherry, and they pay whatever it costs to bring the sherry instead of the bourbon. So the reality basically is that many whiskeys are using sherry casks to hold the whiskey, and it's aged, so it's there for a very, very long time. And so the question is like this. Here's the halachic question. These barrels held sherry wine in them. Not kosher wine. So the non-kosher wine then seeps into the barrels themselves. There's a halachic concept which says that when a liquid stays in a place for a 24-hour period, a certain type of effect happens that it's as if the item was cooked in it. So imagine pickling. Pickling, not like anything actually, there's no fire there, but yet over time, there's an effect that takes place, right? So it's the same thing. When halacha looks at when a liquid is sitting in a container for a certain period of time, we look at it as if this item actually was cooked inside of this container. So in this case, the sherry was in the wine for super long time, and therefore we look at it as if the barrel itself cooked the sherry, and which basically means the same way if I would take a pot and cook non-kosher meat in it, the pot would become treif, because I cooked non-kosher ingredients in the pot. So too, the cask, which holds the sherry and has it for long enough that it's considered like it was cooked in it. So now the cask has non-kosher wine absorbed into it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you go and put whiskey in it, so now the non-kosher wine taste is now going into the kosher whiskey.
And that's on purpose, actually, because they actually want that flavor and
very good
scotch.
So
and aren't you allowed a certain percentage of non-kosher to be mixed in?
Very good, very good. So that's the issue. The issue is that the non-kosher wine taste is going into the kosher whiskey. Now, Sid is asking a very simple question. I understand that a certain amount of wine is going into the whiskey, but how much wine is going into the whiskey already? How much gets absorbed into the barrel?
Doesn't that go back to your point? It's supposed to be after the fact, not on purpose. Like it's like the same idea of blending things up and mevatel it. You're purposely putting it in something that.
No, so it's different. I'll tell you why. Because in the case of a smoothie, I'm actively taking the strawberry, putting it in the blender, and blending it up. Whereas over here, I didn't ask the distiller over there to use a sherry cask.
No, it was not. It was specifically sherry cask.
But I didn't ask him to do that. I mean, I didn't go and take something which had non-kosher and put it into the kosher and mixed it up.
Yeah.
It's there. And so therefore becomes nullified. So the issue becomes when you are presented with a thing and you go and nullify it, that's the problem. But when it was already nullified by somebody else and now you're presented with it. So the question basically is how much wine is going into this whiskey, and therefore is it possible that it will be able to counter whatever taste of wine that's going in? So I'm just going to present different views on this. I'm not going to say, we're not going to do a major deep dive because it really is a major deep dive. But basically, there's a couple of things which have to be worked out. Is the amount that we need to counter the non-kosher taste, how much do we need? How much do we need to nullify? So let's say when it comes to milk falling into a meat pot, what's the amount? 60 times. So we need 60 times of the one to outdo the other. So the question is over here, when it comes to wine, do we need 60 times? Does the contents of the barrel have to be 60 times the amount of wine from the sherry cask that's going in, or some other amount? Now, some of the poskim, some of the rabbinic authorities point to a source which seems to indicate that it's much less. It's actually not 60, it's 6 times. Again, sources, where they get this from, we're not going into right now. So this is one debate which comes up in this discussion. Is it 60 times? Is it 6 times? One thing. Another thing is that when we look at something being cooked, let's say a non-kosher item is cooked in a pot, and then you go and use that pot for something kosher. So how much of the non-kosher thing, did it permeate the entire walls of this vessel, that all the walls of the vessel is just contains non-kosher taste, and when you cook it, that taste is going out? Is that how we view it? That it's all, that entire wall of the pot contains non-kosher thing? Or somehow does it only penetrate a certain distance? So we know when you're cooking with heat travels, it brings things around. So it makes sense that it goes everywhere. So we know with heat that it's the entire pot. We have to measure against the entire pot, the thickness of those walls. But when it comes to something like a cask, where you're not cooking, wasn't actually cooked, it got through because it was just sitting in it for a long time. So how much does it really get through the entire barrel, or does it just get through to the surface, the outer surface of the barrel, not outer, but like the inner surface of the barrel, which touches the wine? How deep does it go? So that's another discussion, debate back and forth. How deep do we say that it goes, and therefore how much of the whiskey do we need to counter it? And is there enough contents in the barrel to counter what might be in the walls? So these are two major considerations about the sherry casks. And look, I know that people generally avoid it today, people try to avoid sherry casks because of these halachic issues, but there are definitely opinions. I believe even Moshe Feinstein, who we've spoken about before, who was a major, halachic authority, held that it was not 60 times, it's 6 times. All we need is that the scotch should be 6 times the amount of sherry that's coming into it, which
for sure,
no big deal, right? It's not a 60th. Then it's 6 times.
These barrels are big.
The barrels are massive, so that's not a problem at all. So definitely, there are prominent, halachic authorities which held that it's okay. But I think the prevailing custom is to avoid it, sherry cask whiskey, because of the issues of whether non-kosher wine, how much it goes in, and since it's already resting on such major disputes and such major issues of halacha, we try to avoid it unless there's a good reason. So that's the issue of the sherry casks. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the Belgian chocolate. So imagine you have Belgian chocolate and it has all the ingredients are kosher. So it's kosher milk. We'll see soon what that means. All the ingredients are kosher. What could be a problem with the Belgian chocolate?
Also.
So Avram saying true, something called chalav Yisrael. What's chalav Yisrael? So let's first understand what makes something kosher milk. Kosher milk basically means milk that was milked from a kosher animal. That's called kosher milk. Milk that came from a kosher animal is kosher milk. Now, the sages took it a step further and said that since definitely at one point in history, there might have been an incentive to switch out kosher milk for non-kosher milk. Maybe kosher milk was worth more tasty than non-kosher milk that was around. So if you go in the Middle East today, camel milk is a thing. I was actually in Wisconsin. I'm not even kidding. I was in Wisconsin about 3 weeks ago, and I saw a big sign advertising camel milk. Yeah, camels give milk, and apparently it's healthy. So in certain parts of the world, it's common. So the sages at one point, out of concern that things would be mixed into milk, they put a thing that said that in order to have kosher milk, a Jew has to watch the process of the milking to make sure that the milking is done correctly and without anyone messing around and putting in non-kosher ingredients. That's called chalav Yisrael. Chalav Yisrael means a Jew watches the process of milk going into from the cow into the thing and making sure that it's all good. Called chalav Yisrael. So even though technically there could be cow's milk, so it's coming from a kosher animal, since if a Jew is not watching it, we won't consider a kosher milk. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, does that mean that every time I pick up a bottle of milk in Walmart and it has an OU on it, does that mean that a Jew watched that cow being milked? Answer is no, right? Your average milk farm, which has an OU, does not have a Jew watching the milk. How is that allowed? If this is something which the sages put in place, how can it be ignored? The answer is really, this goes really way back. And that is, maybe in the times of the Talmud or in the times of the Mishnah, non-kosher animals were being frequently milked, and there could be a concern of mixing one into the other or whatever. But these days, how many non-kosher animals are being milked? And, I don't know if there's any camels being milked in Georgia. Should we be worried about, milk being? The fact is that regular milk is coming from a cow. So the question is, in a place where there's no reason to assume that there are non-kosher animals being milked, can we do away with chalav Yisrael? Do we still need a Jew to watch the process on it? Or can we say, presumably, it's coming from a kosher animal and you can buy it just the way it is? So this is a running debate between various sets of rabbis. They base the debate on different parts of the Talmud, which we're not going to go into right now. But basically, this was a debate between somebody called the Pri Chadash. Pri Chadash is a rabbi in Amsterdam. And he said that in his community, he felt that it's not a problem when there's no real concern for non-kosher milk. There's no problem. And therefore, you don't have to worry about Chalav Yisrael anymore. And he says, I personally drink the not Chalav Yisrael milk in my town because I don't think there's any reason kosher for Chalav Yisrael. Conversely, the Chassam Sofer, who was famously the rabbi who really fought against changes in Judaism and people who try to modernize Judaism. So the Chassam Sofer said that no, these things don't work like that. We don't willy-nilly get to decide when things do apply or don't apply. If something was instituted at a certain point, only a court which is equal in prominence can undo what the previous court did. And since they instituted something called Chalav Yisrael, we need to follow that that way of treating milk, and therefore Chalav Yisrael still stands. And this is a raging debate between the Pri Chadash, the Chassam Sofer, and this went on for centuries. Now, most people follow the Chassam Sofer, not the Pri Chadash. So most people felt that Chalav Yisrael is a must. There's no option not to have Chalav Yisrael. The Pri Chadash was a bit of an outlier in this sense, until we got to modern times in America. And here, Moshe Feinstein, who famous rabbi we spoke about before, came out with a very novel approach. He said, not that we're going to rely on the fact that there's probably no non-kosher animals being milked, so probably it's kosher milk. Because that's already saying, that's already messing around. That's already applying your own logic here. Moshe says today where a farm will actually be sued and be defamed and be fined by the government if they find out that any non-kosher ingredients go in there, it's not just that, they probably won't. It's as if there's a certain concept in halacha sometimes when if you know something with an absolute certainty, we look at it as if we actually saw it happen. It's in Hebrew, we call it anan sadi, which means we are witnesses to this thing happening. So there are certain cases in halacha where we say, this is so absolutely certain, it's as if we saw it. So now, what does Chalav Yisrael mean? That a Jew saw the milking process. So in this case, Rav Moshe felt we are so absolutely sure that non-kosher milk is not going to be added here because you're going to get fined and because you have no incentive. It's as if we watched the milking process. We're making it Chalav Yisrael. So Rav Moshe came up with this, twist which says, not only is it, his twist is that milk nowadays that you buy in a Kroger is Chalav Yisrael. Now, this was a very big deal. That's it?
But you actually say Chalav Yisrael, he just says kosher.
No, it's like Chalav Yisrael. That's his whole point.
Like Chalav.
Again, because if it's just like, probably, well, then you're going back to the Pri Chadash, who debatable if we can do what the Pri Chadash wanted to do. This is like, no, we are so sure about this. It's a non-sa'ad as if we watched it happen.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
I have one more question about the Belgian chocolate.
Yeah.
When we were in Hawaii, we went actually to a non-kosher chocolate making workshop.
Yeah.
And what he said that his big deal was making sure that there were no bugs in the cocoa beans that he gets to crush up. So since we talked about bugs before, I would think the same thing applies for kosher chocolate in Belgium, about the importance of making sure that the cocoa beans are bug-free.
That's very interesting. I would not have even thought bugs in cocoa beans. That's very interesting. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. So basically today, you have this two camps. You have those who follow the way Reb Moshe kind of revolutionized this. And then you have those who say, listen, this was never the way we looked at Chalav Yisrael. Chalav Yisrael means a Jew watches the process of milking, finished. And so you still have these two camps. So Chabad is very strong about keeping Chalav Yisrael the way it always was. And the truth is that many Hasidim do. Many Hasidic communities are very strict about that. Whereas some of the more Litvish, some of the modern Orthodox will go with what Rav Moshe said. and not knocking either way. Both ways are good, but these are just a matter of custom. Now, there is one interesting thing which has changed in recent times, and that is like this, that there's something called DA cows. DA cows. These are cows. DA stands for displaced abomesim. Now, if you don't know that much about cows, like me, you won't know what an abomesim is. But since I had to prepare for this year, I now know what a DA cow is. And a DA cow is basically a cow that has a certain issue that gases build up in its stomach, and it actually ruptures part of its stomach. And it can cause the animal to die, like very quickly. So what these farmers do is that they have to release the gas. So they puncture the stomach of the animal. Now, that puncturing of the stomach of the animal can cause the animal to become something called a treifa, meaning its limbs, its organs are damaged. An animal whose organs are damaged is not kosher anymore, which means the milk that it produces is not kosher either. So this happens all the time. You have many, many, many animals that are DA cows. You also have many animals in general which are just simply not kosher. Many animals that are, this was back in the 50s. Rabbi Soloveitchik, you might have heard of Rabbi Soloveitchik. So he, at one point, was the guy who was watching, he was in charge of the shchita, of the slaughtering of animals in Boston. And he said that when he was there, 14% of the animals that came through, that was shechted, that was slaughtered ritually, like done with the shochet and everything, weren't able to be sold as kosher meat, because after inspecting the animal, after it was slaughtered, it turned out that the animal was a treifa, had its organs were damaged, and therefore it had to be sold as non-kosher meat. So the milk that was coming from that cow was actually not kosher milk. So it turns out until you actually slaughtered the animal, you had no idea that this was non-kosher milk. So to these DA cows, this is non-kosher milk coming from these DA cows. So another additional element to Chalav Yisrael today is that Chalav Yisrael lines will make sure that the milk that is being produced on these Chalav Yisrael lines are not coming from cows that are DA cows. And that's a very interesting thing to think about. Nothing to do with the age-old Chalav Yisrael thing about having a Jew watch that milk won't get mixed in. Completely different thing. It's that the milk won't be coming from an animal, which is a treifa, which is really not just a rabbinic thing, like we were saying, concern that will add milk. No, it's actually a biblical issue. A animal which is a treifa, which produces milk, that is biblically forbidden to drink that milk. It's a very serious thing. And therefore, Chalav Yisrael is something which, takes care of that issue as well. So that's a little bit about kosher and details of keeping kosher and vegan restaurants. And, I hope I didn't make your life too difficult. But this is the life. This is the kosher life. And we do our best to follow it as best as we can. So thanks for joining, and wishing you all a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.